I want to talk today about the two deep sea tragedies that have been extensively covered in the media. One, of course, had to do with a small submersible containing a few very wealthy people who were being lowered down to the Atlantic seabed to view on a flickering small video inside the vehicle the remains of the Titanic. And that, of course, as we know, imploded, catastrophically killing all those aboard. The second maritime tragedy had to do with a trawler overcrowded with refugees seeking to enter illegally into the EU, and it had been followed by the Greek Coast Guard and others and sank, drowning hundreds of people. Now, the commentariat globally quickly jumped onto this coincidental linking of two maritime accidents to claim that there was a lot more attention given to the rich people in the submersible than there was to the apparently rather too ordinary sinking of a refugee trawler. But I want to return to this coincidence because I think there are many more similarities here than there are differences. And there is a contrast, obviously, between the two, but not of the kind that the commentariat seems to have fixated on. Not least because I think the refugee tragedy had perhaps as much attention given to it as the other. So what really brings these two events together apart from their coincidental occurrence in the same period of time? With the submersible, you have a situation of risk-taking. The submersible was unregulated, as we found out immediately afterwards. Its CEO, who also died on board, had famously written or infamously written an email, more than one email, suggesting that regulation was an impediment to innovation. He, of course, was an innovator. So this is the standard language of the neoliberal elite. You know, we need innovation, we don't need regulation, the market takes care of everything, and here we are providing an amazing service, and it is an adventure and a risk. But was it a calculated risk? So what characterizes the submersible tragedy, I think, has to do with the fact that it fits almost entirely into a neoliberal logic of the market, of innovation, of a market that doesn't require any regulation at all. And it is the lack of regulation that makes the market purely a market, which means that calculation no longer enters into the debate or the logic at all. It becomes almost a kind of faith-based activity. You want innovation, you want the unique experience that innovation gets you, you need to take a risk. That risk can be a financial risk, it can be economic risk, it can also be a personal risk. And it was the kind of risk that all the people on the submersible took, not least the CEO, and all of them perished as a consequence. Now, moving on to the refugee boat. Here, of course, we tend not to think about risk and agency, because a risk is often taken to entail agency. That is to say, people must be seen to have a choice to take that risk. And of course, when speaking of refugees, we tend to think of them as having no choice. Indeed, this is the only way in which we're allowed to understand them as being worthwhile victims. In other words, they can only be rescued from moral life as victims without choice. But in fact, did they not have a choice? And did their real life risk-taking and the horrible adventure it entailed not also resemble in some ways, though separated by a vast gulf of wealth and privilege, belong in the same world of the market of faith-based risk-taking rather than a calculated risk, of this pure market with no regulation? That was the world that characterized the submersible, and in a way, arguably, it was the world of the refugee boat as well, insofar as state regulations, which are meant to prevent movement, the movement of people, whether of refugees or not, but especially, of course, of refugees, force them into a market so pure that there's no regulation in it at all. That the risk that they have to take, or that they choose to take, is one which cannot be calculated. It is based purely on faith, or I should say on aspiration. So the aspiration of the people who went down to the submersible, those who had paid the money to have this unique experience, was of course the aspiration to do something that very few other people could possibly do. They would be among the very few in the world who had this experience about which they could then boast later. The experience of the refugee, of course, is very different. It's chosen for a very different reason, and it's chosen perhaps to gain another kind of experience which is not, if you will, so adventurous and which doesn't entail this kind of risk. Nevertheless, it too is a risk and an experience that has been chosen within this new market, created not by state regulation, but by the absence of it. So I'm talking about a market that exists outside the state and its institutions. And I think it's this market that now makes for a new kind of global community, one that links up refugees on the one hand and the super rich on the other, each in their very different ways. Now, when you think of the refugees, as I said, we tend to think of them as people who are perfect victims who have no agency. This I don't think does them any favor. It allows us to pity them and not to blame them for taking an unwise risk. But in fact, when you look at them, or many of them, they have to have been at least lower middle class, if not middle class, in order to pay the kinds of money needed to the smugglers who were to transport them across the Mediterranean. These are not the poorest strata of the countries from which refugees come. Many, if not most of them, also are not fleeing war. The largest number of refugees on that boat, on that trawler, were Pakistani. Now, Pakistan is in a state of almost continuous turmoil at the moment, especially economically, but it is not a country at war. In fact, it is more secure now, socially, than it has been for many years, for about 20 years now in the past, since the war on terror. So what exactly is going on here? The reason I stress the relatively secure, in many cases, status of those who choose to put themselves at risk in this way is to argue that there too you have a form of aspiration. So how are we to understand the similarity of aspiration that characterizes both the refugees and the billionaires who were on the submersible? Of course, they are separated in almost every other way, though some of those on the submersible also came from a country like Pakistan, where most of the refugees came from. So there are overlaps as well. We are not talking about an absolute distinction between the global north and the global south. We are talking about a different kind of distinction between global wealth and global poverty, and sometimes there's an overlap there. So I think what really brings them together and what brings that logic of aspiration together is the fact that there now exists a global society outside, very often, the state and its regulatory frameworks. And it's a society that is built on a global market or a global marketplace, which no longer has any regulations attached to it. And it no longer has regulations attached to it precisely because the states, which regulate their own national economies and the international economy, really shuts out and shuts down when it comes to these kinds of illegal or illicit flows, what they determine to be illicit flows of whether it's goods or persons. And in doing so, they do really nothing more than widen the expanse of this new kind of global marketplace without regulations. Now, that marketplace really has resulted in the making of what I'm calling a global community. Many of the refugees, perhaps even most of them, are going to places in Europe or indeed even in the Americas where they may have relatives or friends. This society already exists, and it allows for risk-taking at many different levels. Now, the fact that these two disasters happened at sea, of course, is rhetorically perfect in the sense that the sea best represents this amorphous, unregulated element where anything can and often does happen. There are no lines in it, apparently. But the sea, of course, is not the only place this happens. And you have tragedies of a similar kind happening on land, not only refugees crossing by land, but people who otherwise seem to be relatively well off, who go as tourists to a country like Canada, for instance, and then try to cross the border into the United States illegally and freeze to death in the process. This has happened to at least one family from the state of Gujarat in India. So there too you have a kind of strangely uncalculated risk, a risk that happens this time on land, not on sea, but that is comparable both to the refugees going down on their boat in the Mediterranean and, curiously or paradoxically, to the super wealthy individuals going down on the submersible. They all occupy very different strata within this new global community made up of an unregulated market.